dating to about 800,000 years, proof that man was using fire not just as an incidental, but actually had a little bit of skill at maybe making it, and keeping it, and knew what to do with it very early, but still there. Fifth night of the tribal cycle was the beginning of a procession of very severe ice ages. Ice ages. So, did the development that came from the fifth day, discovery of fire, maybe help consciousness evolve through the ice ages? Probably so. Fire probably helped a lot of people. In the cultural cycle, the fifth day is the period of time when, and again this happens almost globally, art begins to show up. Early cave paintings, people keeping things as totems or personal items, whether it was a bear claw or a saber's tooth or whatever. The beginning of art and everything that art implies, not the least of which is an idea of the future. Because art, in a lot of ways, was used as prayer. It wasn't simply a matter to go to your cave when it was time to hunt in that area and draw pictures of what you got last year. I mean, really. What it really was saying, this is what we've seen when we've come here before, and this is what we expect to see when we come back next season. Buffalo on the wall. This is what we're going to see when we come back here. Future forecasting. Big consciousness development in the simple act of humans beginning to make art. All right? The fifth night of the cultural cycle. Well, it was time to say goodbye, just like the pod that gets ejected and those kind of things. And it was none other than Neanderthal that we said goodbye to, because it was during the fifth night of this cycle that Neanderthal went extinct, about 32,000 years ago. And scientists are pretty much agreed that what happened to poor Neanderthal was this, that for 100,000 years they had hunted the same herds, they had traveled and lived in the same areas, they had lived in the same caves, wore the same types of clothes, used the same types of tools, picked up a few things from some of the other evolving hominids around them, never really got it, they could imitate some, they just didn't change for 100,000 years. And what happened? Creation kept going. And they went extinct. So if there's a lesson for any of us in Neanderthal, it should be, don't get stagnant, the Rolling Stone, all of that, right? That's what happens. If we're not changing, if we're not constantly expanding our consciousness, then we're just stuck and we're not participating in creation as it's meant to be, or in its fullest, one could argue. Okay. In the national cycle, the fifth day, period just about 40 AD, Christ consciousness. After Jesus' death, this is when the very early apostles, what most of the New Testament is written about, and the early church, this all begins during the fifth day of the national cycle. Fifth night of the national cycle, fall of Rome. Roman Empire had reached its peak, no more, could sustain itself, and was gone. In the seventh cycle, the planetary cycle, the fifth day represents a period right around 1913, just after the turn of the last century. This is a time when we saw Einstein come on the scene with some incredible ideas about reality. Namely, things like energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, E equals mc squared. Atomic blueprint, basically, for reality is what Einstein gave us back then in the fifth day. That's also about the same period of time when a fellow named Edwin Hubble came along and with his telescopes and his discoveries told the world at that time that the universe is infinite. We take that for granted today because we've lived with that as a reality for almost all our lives, that the universe is infinite. But that wasn't taken for granted back then. It was hotly debated. Does it have a definite size? Whatever. Hubble came along and said, no, sure enough, it's infinite, and it just keeps getting bigger, if you can believe it. Everything's moving away from everything else at these incredible speeds, and it's an infinite universe. So in the fifth day of the planetary cycle, we were given the blueprints of reality and the realization that the universe is infinite. And in the fifth night, we applied that knowledge. In World War II, in the atomic tests that we conducted throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s and still today. And also, interestingly, in something that's called the technosphere. The technosphere. I said earlier that existing along this 1320 harmonic frequency of creation was this artificial one that started back here in 3100 BC, this 1260. This 1260 has been subject to the very same process of 13 levels, or 7 days and 6 nights of creation, that the 1320 that's encoded in this is. In other words, the 1260 was a seed that was planted in 3100 BC. The fifth night of the planetary cycle saw the fruit of that seed began to come into place. And we call it the technosphere. And that is simply, the biosphere is where we live on Earth. It's everything from just a little bit below the surface and in the waters to just a little bit above the surface, not too high because we can't breathe up there, but we can live in the mountains. But that's the biosphere of the Earth. This is where everything bios lives. The technosphere is an artificial creation of man, the only creature capable of doing it. And the technosphere exists separate for one reason. It's disharmonious with the natural timing frequency of 1320. How can you verify this? Well, the technosphere exists at the expense of the biosphere, which is the dilemma that our age faces today. Whether you want to call it global warming, pollution, nuclear holocaust,
carbon footprint,
whatever, yeah, antibiotic resistant bacteria, killer viruses, whatever. The technosphere that we have built up, and it lives at the expense of the biosphere because it's not renewable, it's not sustainable. I know those are buzzwords and catchwords, but they do have meaning. And what happens to any parasite benign or otherwise, that is not in harmony with or that takes more from its host than it gives back. Both the host and the parasite perish, which is what, as a species, the dilemma that we face today. I don't mean to put it into such apocalyptic terms necessarily, but this is where we are. The 1260 timing frequency has been growing along this guideline the entire time. And we've seen now we live in its almost fullness. All right? And we'll talk about that as we talk here about this galactic age. Because when did this begin? All right, let me back up for just 1 second. Because we're talking about all these cycles, and I keep saying that we still live in the national cycle. What do I mean by that? All right? The cellular cycle, 16.4 billion years ago. The seventh day of that cycle is 1.26 billion years long. We still live in that 1.26 billion year time period at the end of it. Understand? 820 million years ago, the mammalian cycle began. The seventh day, the last day of this cycle, 63.1 million years ago. Fits real nicely into 1.26 billion, doesn't it? We still live in this cycle. Right? How do we know? Well, are there cells still? Okay. Are there mammals? We're still there. Families? We're still living in that cycle. Tribal cycle, 2 million years ago? We're still living in that 158,000 years. Cultural cycle. We still live in the last 8,000 years of the cultural cycle. We still live in the last 400 years, the last back tune, the last 144,000 days of the national cycle. Now it gets fun. We still live in the last 20 years of the planetary cycle. The galactic cycle started January of 1999. I'm not going to ask you to put your thinking caps on because I wasn't capable of doing it. And if you're as confused as I think you probably are at this point, you wouldn't have any hope of doing it. 99, I'll just tell you what was going on back then. Y2K. Now you remember, don't you? That was what was going on. Y2K. At the beginning of this cycle, this next to last cycle in the evolution of human consciousness. It was also the beginning of the World Trade Organization protests. Specifically, the battle in Seattle, where the Constitution of the United States was suspended for a day in downtown Seattle in order to protect the elite of the world who were going to make the financial decisions that we were all going to live with for the next 20 years. Okay? All of this was happening at the beginning of this cycle. You get to the second night of the galactic cycle, 9/11. Okay? I'm just trying to give you some perspective to put you, because this is real familiar, right? Each day of the galactic cycle that began in 1999 lasts 360 days.